This presentation shows how to immobilize a femur fracture using rigid splints. It also shows how to prepare the person to be moved or transported after splinting. A subsequent presentation will show a method that can be used when rigid splints are not available. Here's the injury, a mid-third femur fracture. That has to hurt. The materials we will use include 2 rigid splints, 7 splint ties, and padding. The first step is to prepare the splint ties. We're using triangular bandages. To make a wide splint tie, start by folding the point of the bandage to the base. Fold the bandage a second time to make a wide bandage. One more fold will give you a narrow bandage. You will need 6 wide bandages and 1 narrow bandage. The ties must now be carefully positioned under the person. Use the natural body hollows to get the bandages under the person and slide them into position. The first tie is placed level with the armpits. The second tie goes under the pelvis. The third tie is positioned at the top of the thigh, above the injury. The fourth tie goes right below the injury. The closer these ties are to the injury site, the more stable the fracture will be. Tie number 5 is positioned under the knee. Tie 6, at mid-calf, and the final tie, the only narrow bandage, is positioned under the ankle. You will now need to prepare the splints. We are using 1 long splint and 1 short splint. The long splint will extend from the armpit to just beyond the foot on the outside of the leg. The short splint will extend from the groin to beyond the foot on the inside of the leg. The length of the splints is important because they must immobilize the joint above as well as the joints below the injury. Both splints will need to be padded on the side that contacts the body. Position the splints and add any extra padding as needed to fill the body contours or hollow spaces between the body and splint for comfort. The next step is to secure the ties from the top down. Knots should be tied over the top of the splint for comfort. If you must tie a knot over the body, be sure you place padding under it. The chest tie is secured first, followed by the tie at the pelvis, the top of the thigh, which in this case is right above the injury. Below the injury, the knee, mid-calf and ankle. The tie used at the ankle is a figure of 8. Check all of your knots to make sure they are secure, but not so tight as to cut off the circulation in the limb. The splinting is now complete. But if you will be moving the person, you will need to secure the legs together, so the body can be lifted or maneuvered safely as a unit. To do this, you will need a blanket and 3 ties. Fold the blanket or large towel in half lengthwise so there are at least 2 layers. Fold one end down to cover 2/3 of the remaining section. 1/3 of the blanket now has 2 layers, while the remaining 2/3 of the blanket has 4 layers. Fold down the top again so you are left with 1/3 of the blanket with 2 layers of thickness, 1/3 of the blanket with 4 layers of thickness, and 1/3 of the blanket with 8 layers. Fold the blanket in half lengthwise to form a wedge. The narrow end of the wedge will be positioned at the top of the thigh and the wide end at the foot to mimic the contour of the space between the legs. Position ties under both legs. One at the top of the thigh, one at the knees, and one at the ankles. Position the blanket between the legs. Draw the uninjured leg toward the injured leg to minimize the space between the limbs. Secure the ties from the top down, starting at the top of the thigh, then the knees. Use a figure of 8 bandage to secure the ankles. Check all of the ties to make sure everything is snug. That's it. In this presentation you have learned how to immobilize a femur fracture using rigid splints, and how to prepare the person to be moved or transported after splinting. Now, it's time for a quiz.